housekeeping as we get started this evening. Because we are in webinar mode, attendees are muted and you won't be able to unmute, but you can use the chat function for comments. And also we encourage you to use the Q&A feature for questions. And if you're not quite sure how to locate that, if you scroll to the bottom of your screen, you'll see where it says Q&A. You can click that button and you'll be able to drop your questions in there, and that will help us keep track of those questions and do our best to answer them during the webinar this evening. And as we start out, we always like to share a land acknowledgement. And so first, I want to acknowledge that where I am here in Northern Virginia, as in every other part of our country, we are on Indigenous land. I recognize that I live and work within the ancestral lands of the Manahoac people. I acknowledge the place-based knowledge of these peoples, and I am grateful for their stewardship of these lands. And I invite you to place in the chat the name of the people whose land you rely upon now. And if you're not sure where to find it, we just dropped in the chat a link to the Native Land website where you can look up the name of the people whose land that you rely upon. So as we get started this evening, I want to just talk a little bit about why we're here this evening. So people of faith understand the importance of using their prophetic voices to call the faithful to live by their most deeply held values. This November, Interfaith Power and Light will have a presence as an observer organization at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, to ensure that world leaders hear the moral voice as they debate strategies and ambitions to effectively tackle the global challenge of climate change. Our witness is crucial. And I'm delighted to be hosting this conversation today with three incredible climate and environmental advocates who have been bringing the faith voice to these UN climate negotiations for several years. So we will have time for Q&A towards the end of the hour. And again, I encourage you to drop your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get them answered. But right now, I want to introduce our amazing panelists. So we're going to start with Bea Moorhead, who serves as the Executive Director of Texas Impact and Texas Interfaith Power and Light, which is one of the state affiliates in our IPL network that includes 40 state affiliates. And we have attendees going to the COP from several of our state affiliates as well. So thank you, Bea, for being here. The Reverend Melanie Mullen, who serves as the Director of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care for the Episcopal Church, and is a member of the IPL Board of Directors. Welcome, Melanie. And Gopal Patel, who is the founder and director of Bhumi Global, the Hindu movement for Mother Earth. And Gopal is also a member of the IPL Board of Directors. So welcome to you, Gopal. And I also want to just say a quick thank you to IPL team members, Rebecca and Eiley and Tiffany, who are overseeing our technology this evening, and we really appreciate you being here and helping us with that. So as we start this evening, we're actually going to begin with a short clip. It's a few minutes long from a resource that was created by Texas Impact and Texas IPL entitled The Path of Hope. And it was done 3 years ago now, hard to believe, when we were all in Madrid for the climate talks. And it was a wonderful resource for congregations to use to help discern why and how faith communities should be a part of these negotiations and how we can leverage our voice as we urge action, especially here with our US government. So we're going to show this brief clip now, and then we'll start with some questions for our guests.
The world is getting hotter and more dangerous faster than we ever thought possible. Irreversible tipping points are within sight and hurtling towards us. As the logo for COP25 suggests, it is 5 minutes to midnight in the global climate emergency. By the end of the coming decade, we will be on one of two paths. One is the path of surrender, where we have sleepwalked past the point of no return, jeopardizing the health and safety of everyone on this planet.
I think one of the challenges when we talk about the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and these COPs is that they seem very disconnected from things that we normally engage with.
I think it's kind of interesting. You know, we've been talking about decoding the COP for faith communities back home. And I think essentially what we're talking about is the fact that what happens here at the international level is really interconnected to what happens both back home at the federal level and then also at the local and state level.
We want to make sure that our folks understand that dealing with the environment, addressing climate change, is not a separate ministry, but it's a ministry of the church.
My name's Linnea May. I serve as the Episcopal Church's representative to the United Nations. The United Nations is made up of countries, member states as we call them. There are member states, and then which consists of governments, and then we have another sector called non-governmental organizations, or you may hear it referred to as civil society, which is the rest of us. So that could include companies, it can include universities, trade unions, and it also includes faith-based organizations.
My name is Bill Simplowski-Jarman, and I worked for 32 years for the national offices of the Presbyterian Church, and I'm here as a volunteer to help involve the church continuously in the efforts to fight climate change. We've been present at this whole process from the very beginning in 1992 at the Earth Summit when they signed the convention. World leaders, 190 of them descended upon Rio to sign that convention and one on biodiversity. Religious and faith-based communities were here to participate in that process, and we've been here ever since.
The word COP has nothing to do with law enforcement, although in some ways it does, but it's called the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the parties, this is a conference of parties, so it doesn't mean there are millions of parties happening, although they do happen, nice, polite receptions. But the parties are the actual signatories to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the major piece of international legislation around the environment and climate that came into force around 2000. So the Conference of Parties refers to the member states who have signed the Framework Convention. So they're called the parties. So we are not part of the party. We are the crashers of the party, so to speak, the observers who come along, and we have the right to be here, but we are here to observe and not to vote or make decisions at the COP. That said, the role we have here is very, very important all the same.
The Framework Convention began as a response to a scientific assessment. And I think many of the first COPs were very focused on the sort of scientific, and you see even in the work stream still, a reflection of that science-focused, evidence-based work, really important. But the scientists can diagnose the problem, they may not be the best to address the solutions. And so having the voices of frontline communities, indigenous communities, people of faith, others who are sort of living the realities of the changing climate every day, be it in response to disasters, communities that are either sending or receiving migrants, having those voices a part of the solution is really important. And so I think from my own understanding of my faith and my sort of particular United Methodist lens, that sense of connection and justice is really important to me.
I think that we like our issues siloed because it feels easier, to manage, just like, climate change or hunger or water, immigration, whatever it is. And climate change is a big tent issue, right? It is so intersected to all of these other issues. It exacerbates all of these other issues. And for me personally, I came to the issue of climate change through the lens of hunger. That was the issue that I worked on for many years as a pastor in a local congregation, was the issue of hunger. And it wasn't until I made the connection between, the loss of harvest due to drought and wildfire that were fueled by climate change and increasing global food shortages and rising grain prices and the rise of conflict in some parts of the world around that, I was able to make the connection that, I need to work on climate change.
We had the opportunity at this COP to meet with the U.S. delegation from Congress. That was a bicameral delegation led by Speaker Pelosi.
We're here to talk positively about our agenda to save the planet for future generations.
And to a person, they said they needed to hear more from people of faith in their communities, hear from it from the pulpit, hear from it into their offices. So I think the first and foremost that folks can do is speak up and speak out. It's important for us as people of faith to raise our voice, to talk about our moral call for climate action, and to stand in solidarity with those who are being impacted by a changing climate.
Do we really want to be remembered as the generation that buried its head in the sand, that fiddled while the planet burned? The other option is the path of hope.
Thank you to Bea and her team for putting that resource together. I saw some conversation in the chat about whether it's available, and absolutely yes, we hope that you are going to use it in your faith communities and help people to understand these connections much more clearly. So we really appreciate that resource, Bea. Thanks so much to you and your team. And so we're going to just dig into to a set of questions here. As I said, we'll save some time for Q&A as well. So be thinking about your questions that you'd like to pose to our panelists this evening. But Bea, we're gonna start with you because this was a snapshot that sort of started in 2019, right? You saw all the signs behind us from Madrid and so on. And of course, the US was in a much different position in 2019 going into the COP than we are this year. And so I wondered if you could help frame that for us. How is the US positioned going into this COP and what is different?
Thanks for the question and thanks for having me on the panel. So yeah, the position of the United States is very much different right now. So just to go back a little bit to 2015, when the Paris Agreement was made, the United States was in a very, we felt great, right? We had a president who was personally invested in climate. We felt like we were driving a lot of the conversation. And then the political situation in our country changed a lot, and that made us in a different position globally. So for the past few years, the United States has been going to the COP kind of in a defensive posture a little bit and not able to have that feeling of moral authority, maybe a little bit of the feeling that you need to get your own house in order before you can come here and tell us everybody else what to do. This year, the United States, and I would say in some really meaningful ways, has taken steps to, in some ways, kind of go back to that moment in 2015. In 2015, the United States made some promises about what we would do, that we would reduce our emissions, that we were gonna, be leaders on the global stage. And this year, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, Congress put in place tools for the country to meet those goals, right? So we have, for the first time, sort of a set of tools that are acknowledged to be related to the emissions reductions we promised we would make. It's not enough. It's not enough to manage for what the world needs, all of those things. But I think the United States is going into this COP feeling a sense of self-vindication, our negotiators, our State Department folks, can go into those global negotiations feeling like the positions that they are advocating are reflecting the best of what the United States has been able to do as a community, and not maybe a little bit airing dirty laundry in public. So that's very important. It's also true that we've done other things in this country over the past couple of years, and we're continuing to have a conversation about methane, about clean cars. Those things are great too, but I think the big centerpiece is the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act is specifically tied to that moment in Paris when we made a big, ambitious statement about what we thought we could do, and now it looks like maybe we can't.
Thanks, Bea. I think that's really helpful framing. And we have had some conversations, of course, with the State Department folks who are feeling more empowered this year going into COP27 than perhaps they have for a while, which is great. But we also know there's some really big issues that are up for debate this year at this COP, and some more contentious than others, I would say. The U.S. has certainly been a leader on climate mitigation, especially with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, as you said. But there are several other things on the table this year as we work towards implementing the Paris Climate Agreement. And so I want to turn to Melanie, because I'm hoping that you can help us unpack some of the major issues that you expect to be negotiated this year, and talk a little bit about why those are resonant for U.S. faith communities. And in particular, I was hoping, like, let's start with the issue of loss and damage, because that is high on the list of a lot of organizations globally, and a lot of nations globally. But also it's sort of wonky terminology and not everybody knows what that means. And like, can you help us understand what that is and why it is so important to us?
Yeah, thank you so much. I have been just blessed and honored to be, as a person of faith, entering into these discussions. And with the help of our 22 delegates, virtual and in person, some of whom have PhDs in these matters, we have taken to help the whole church understand that, number one, loss and damage is paramount for us, because it's about our ethics. It's about our moral situation. And many of us were moved last year when the Prime Minister of Barbados said that loss and damage is about the failure to provide critical finance. Because when we don't count morally, we end up measuring loss and damage in the terms of lives. And so we as people of faith get to say, wait a minute, we want to talk about how much people's livelihoods and culture is worth when big corporations and governments are doing this accounting. So I love to think that there are lots of ways that we faith people can encourage the bits of loss and damage and reclaiming those, the scope of that for a morally relevant place, where we're thinking about the things that we've sort of promised, not just financing, but our church folks are really excited about using grants instead of loans. We're really, really enthusiastic about the Santiago discussions and the Warsaw mechanisms, ways in which we can support governments and folks doing the negotiation to put into place a level playing field, because we're all about a God that not just fair, but looks at the world equitably for the well-being of people. So every week we are taking a different one of these words: loss and damage, adaptation, mitigation, having a Zoom event, having a Facebook posting about it, so we can all learn that these are not abstract concepts, but concepts about ethics and loving and not leaving anybody who's vulnerable behind.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. And I wonder, because, you know, we have these like four, well, I've kind of put them into four big buckets. Other people may have other numbers of buckets, but loss and damage being certainly one of those. Mitigation, which we've touched on just a little bit, but mitigation being actually about lowering our climate pollution. And of course, nations have made pledges to do so, which we are supposed to be taking stock of and seeing how our nation's actually doing in meeting those goals. Adaptation being how are communities adapting to the actual impacts of climate change that are already happening. And of course, many folks here in the US are well aware of that. We just had a major hurricane that hit Florida. We've had wildfires and droughts and floods. And then this issue of finance and how are we paying our fair share as the largest historic emitter in the world. And so I want to just kind of touch on those things briefly because, and Melanie, I think maybe you can help us understand a little bit because of these conversations that are happening. How, when we talk about US disasters versus global disasters, how are we thinking about those in terms of loss and damage? Because we know the devastation that happened in Florida just very, very recently with the hurricane. But we're also seeing, of course, the just enormous impacts of flooding, for example, in Pakistan, and the long-term damage and the length of time, recovery time that's going to take. So can you help us unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, and I am learning, as all of us are, about how deep the reaches of loss and damage are. And when I think about loss and damage for people of faith, I'm hearing the phrase jubilee, first of all, biblical concepts that as the impact on really vulnerable nations and communities is higher for some, it also means that the financial impact is a heavier burden for those same vulnerable communities. And I know we're part of communions that are global in scope. So when we think about our siblings and faith and around the world, the idea that smaller, more vulnerable nations have more of a burden to bear. And I loved our conversations we have with our US delegates, thinking about not that no one wants to respond to crises, storms, hurricanes, floods around the world, but there's always this tension of competing goods. There's so many things that we want to respond to, we as individuals and as nation states. And the fact that we hope we can put pressure on our nation state to say that making sure that we fulfill our promises, that there is this response fund available for those vulnerable nations, that it really happens. And so that we know that many, many important things are happening, but we've made some commitments, as V said, to fund these things, and that we want to put the pressure on to say that we're not going to get this lost in a sea of competing goods, that we have a stake to say that we're going to make do with our response funds promises, and the idea that we can make something available for those that are most vulnerable.
Thank you. That's really helpful to hear that explanation, because there is this burden on poorer countries for sure, and the situation between loans and grants and other forms of financing, and also the debt burden that many countries are already bearing, really has to play into the whole financing conversation as well. So appreciate that. And Gopal, I want to turn to you. You've been going to these climate conferences for, I don't know, since Paris, I think, and you've been very involved in the UN and the UN Environment Program, and they talk about this triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. And you have been very focused on the issue of biodiversity. So first of all, can you help us understand what biodiversity is for those who don't know? And also, what are you looking for at COP27?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. It's great to be with you and the IPL family this evening. This is the thing with the UN. It's an acronym soup. It's words that people don't know what they mean. It's jargon. It's scientific. It's technocratic. Biodiversity for me just means nature, or the natural world, or I like to call the web of life. It's oceans and rivers, mountains, plants, trees, but also animals and aquatics as well. So it's literally the fabric of life, the web of life, everything we see around us. And so in terms of what I'm looking for coming out of COP27, obviously, as Melanie spoke about, the financing is going to be a big focus at COP27 this year. I think also looking for strong progress and movement around what we call the NDCs, naturally determined contributions. That's what are countries committing to in terms of reducing their carbon emissions so that we can be in line with the Paris Agreement. And there were some major announcements last year in Glasgow at COP26, but more announcements need to be made. And so hopefully in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, we'll see those. So those are the two things I'm seeing. But outside of that, for biodiversity, for nature, I'm really looking forward to seeing nature taking more of a central role when we talk about climate change, when we talk about adaptation and mitigation as well. There's a phrase that, again, it's another funny phrase. It's called nature-based solutions, NBS. And again, that is just a fancy way of saying protecting, restoring, and conserving the natural world. And if I can give like a big level example of an NBS, a nature-based solution, is protecting rainforests. So just by protecting rainforests as they exist and as they stand in the world today, if we don't cut down any more trees, we will achieve 30% of the Paris climate targets, just by not cutting down any more trees and protecting our rainforests. So that's a nature-based solution. Don't cut any more trees. Let's save the Amazon and the other tropical rainforests around the world, and we will hit 30% of what we need to keep under 1.5. Right? So that's a nature-based solution. Other ideas of nature-based solutions are, managing other ecosystems, whether it's wetlands or savannas or coral reefs or mangroves and so on like that. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how nature plays more of a role when we're talking about climate change, because as UNEP frame it, these are a triple planetary crisis, and they're all interlinked. Because if we solve the climate crisis, but don't solve the biodiversity crisis, we're still going to be in a very, very bad situation. And so I'm also looking for momentum leading to another COP, which is called COP15, which is taking place in Montreal in December. And that's a biodiversity COP. It's going to be focused just on biodiversity. And that COP is going to agree a new 10-year framework for biodiversity. It's going to be the equivalent of the Paris Agreement, that is for climate. So I'm looking for nature to be front and center this year at COP27 to build momentum to the biodiversity COP, which is going to take place literally like 2 weeks after we leave Egypt. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for. Early Christmas presents, so to speak.
That's amazing. Thank you. And now we've thoroughly confused everyone about why there's one COP, and we won't get into that. We're gonna 100% focus on the one coming up in Egypt. But yes, that conference is also very, very important. And certainly, I appreciate your framing for what does a win really look like, and we do want to talk about the win for the people and also for the planet and all of that web of life that you've named. And also, so I'm going to shift back to B, because I also want to talk about what does a win look like for sort of the process, right? Because there's a whole process piece. And I know for the Interfaith Power and Light Network, we're very, very focused on how to engage our supporters, people of faith and conscience all over the US who care about these issues, but really aren't quite sure how in the world they would engage with this process if they're not going to Egypt. And B, you've been participating in the COP since Paris as well, and emphasizing the role that faith communities play to push the US government to pass much needed climate policies. And as you already said, we had a win this year. The Inflation Reduction Act was a huge win in terms of climate investments passed through Congress after much struggle and delay. But because of advocates all over the country who did not let up, did not let go of this, and said we have to get it done. So I just am curious if you could share a little bit about how the work looks on the ground. You're working very much at the local and the state level in Texas, and certainly not the easiest environment to work in. And I'm just curious if you can describe a little bit what role people of faith and conscience are playing in policy advocacy.
Sure, absolutely. And just to kind of talk to the process maybe in a holistic way. So the process, Gopal said, right, it's technocratic and full of acronyms and all of those things. And it is also full of diplomats. So the people who are there, who are actually negotiating the things at the COP, the agreements and all of the little pieces of what they do. The faith community is not those people. We are not the people who can decide to have it this way or that way. So we have to use influence. And it turns out the influence that our people have most potently, wherever they are in the world, and certainly wherever they are in the United States. Certainly in the United States, the most potent influence people have comes from their own story and their own understanding of the world. So it's important for American faith communities to talk about loss and damage. For example, it's important for them to understand what's going on in other countries. It's important for them to be able to witness and to relate to the suffering of people in other parts of the world. But when it comes to their influence is on the people they vote for, the people they live in community with, the people who are closer to them. So a lot of the job of the faith community at the COP is to translate this global process into something that you, the local person in the faith community, can use to do work and have agency. So what we think is that as you're thinking about what's going on at the COP, you want to be supportive of what the global negotiators are doing, but you want to hold accountable the people who are in your community. That's why the Inflation Reduction Act is so important, because we made a commitment on the global stage, but the only way to make good on that commitment is for our city council members and our state legislators and our local agencies to do the things that will achieve that NDC, those emissions reductions. I guess that's my pitch. That I've been making that pitch all year, so nobody who knows me knows that this isn't new news. But the pitch is what you should do as you're watching the COP happen is you should learn everything you can and process the information. Who you should talk to when it's over is your elected officials, and you should say, I see what's happening. My faith community is participating on this global level. Don't mess it up. We care about this thing too. We want federal appropriations. We want state action. We want local initiatives that will make it real for everybody in the world, including us, the voters in your district.
That's a great explanation, Bea, and I really appreciate that. And Gopal, I'm curious because you've been so involved, at the UN level, and I'm curious, listening to Bea's explanation of sort of what we have to do here at home in the US. How do you do other countries approach the process in the same way? I'm just sort of curious, about the level of engagement that perhaps is happening between those negotiators that are showing up in the room to what's happening, at the level of their national government versus how engaged folks are on the ground in advocacy. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I knew you were going to ask me this, so I was thinking about it a little bit earlier on. And it is fascinating because, as Bea was speaking about earlier, the last number of years, the last number of COPs, the US position or the US mood has been a little bit more humble. than in previous years, in terms of like, in a sense of like, sorry, and please, we want to work with you, and so I think what is happening in a country, amongst civil society in that specific country or in the politics of that particular country does impact how the negotiators certainly show up, and also what's happening in the region as well, geopolitically as well. That definitely impacts as well. And then you'll also see there's a reason that the COPs are in different parts of the world every year. So this is the Africa COP. Right, so African countries are going to be showing up in a strong way to advocate for what they need, because we know Africa has, as a continent, has only contributed 0.7% of global greenhouse gas emissions, something minuscule like that, but is disproportionately affected to climate when it comes to climate change. So African leaders are really going to step up in a significant way. Next year, it's going to be, I believe, in Dubai. So the Middle East countries are going to step up in certain ways. Last year, when it was in the UK, in Glasgow, the UK, civil society was really active. And so as it moves around in different parts of the world, you see certain countries or certain blocks really stepping up in significant ways. And in certain countries, maybe just stepping back a little bit because the spotlight isn't on them so much. And so as B is saying, regardless of where the COP is taking place, it's imperative for people of faith here in the United States, but in every part of the world, to really step up. And it's an opportunity to talk about it, to talk to your neighbors, your family and friends and so on like that, because it is a global moment, regardless of where it is. And it will be on the news, hopefully every night and in the newspapers. And so it's a really good opportunity to raise this as a conversation piece around dinner or in the church pews or somewhere like that, because this is a key moment when we can talk about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I appreciate that outlook on especially on how African nations will engage this year. I think it's incredibly important, and of course goes back to our conversation about loss and damage in so many ways, and adaptation and finance, which is critical. And I know folks are probably wondering sort of like, well, how do I engage in this, from home? Like what are the opportunities for me to be involved? And, are there, of course, we've shared some resources out, but also, how do I follow the news? How do I engage with you, from where I am? And so I want to kind of turn to all of you a little bit for these questions, and also just remind folks, if you have questions, to go ahead and drop them into the Q&A, and because we'll be turning to the Q&A just shortly here. But wondering, first of all, B, how do you suggest that folks engage with those of us who will be in Egypt from here in the US? So let's start with you, and then I want to go to Melanie, because I think you have some other insight as well, because some of your delegation is participating virtually.
So, excuse me. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't start with the queen of all how to participate from home, which is social media, right? So we'll all be on social media, and so Texas Impact is one of many organizations that take a video crew to the COP, which is how we had the video that we showed at the beginning also. So we'll be posting videos, and we are hopefully, our plan is to spend more time than we have in the past interviewing people who are from the United States, who are from local areas around the United States, so that people who are from, Des Moines or Virginia or California or wherever can have a sense that their local officials are participating as well. So I think so sharing and watching and consuming information is thing number one, and that's my contribution to this portion, is consume what we produce is one way you can participate.
Thank you, B. And I'm also going to drop in a link in the chat where you can follow our blog posts. We don't currently have any blog posts from Egypt up there, but you can certainly follow our team, as well as some of our other faith-based and environmental advocates that we'll be interacting with. We'll be sharing blogs throughout the COP on that post. And so, Melanie, let's turn to you.
Yeah, I think we are sort of blessed to have been a part of a world that emerged into full tech competency. And so there's so many pieces of this that even any of us who aren't physically in Egypt can really get engaged in the important parts. So it's not just consuming, but be a part of the watching with groups of dialogues and NGO watchers on the ground, following the mitigation, the adaptation, or the loss and damage discussions, and raising questions and issues about it for our teams. There are even pre and post-event conversations, the Tal Noah dialogues, a process that has become very popular, using the Pan-Pacific word meaning transparent processes and dialogues. You can even get online and join some of the NGO discussions about how do we envision a fuller and better set of negotiations online. And that's, here, I'll drop a link in the chat. So be a part of how NGOs as a community are engaging our negotiators, governments in the world with that. Following online as well, but being a part of, like I said, many of us are watching eagerly in intergenerational, interfaith, intercommunity groups that are tracking resolutions and tracking what's happening. And so follow us online, but also be a part of the kind of daily discussions. Some of them might be pretty early in the morning, but if you want to follow us on Twitter to know where we're all sort of virtually meeting. We're going to be meeting at Episco Climate or Creation Care on Facebook. But there are lots and lots of groups who will be rethinking their strategy every morning at the crack of dawn or midnight for you to figure out what's being lost here and who's not at the table, as we want to make sure that Indigenous communities and sovereignties are brought up, that young people, that migrants, their energies, their issues, and their representative nature is being raised up. So we can all join in online in some kind of way to help lift up those voices.
Great, thanks, Melanie. And I know I've seen in the chat, you know, there's some interest in nature-based solutions and the biodiversity conversation. And Gopal, I just was curious if you have some resources that you would direct folks to, or ways that they can participate from home on any of those discussions that are upcoming.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. B and Melanie, what they've shared is so great. I want to like maybe take a different tack. I think one thing I'll pop a link in the chat after my remarks. I think one thing that is really powerful about these COP moments is it's a great learning opportunity. You know, you have all the world's best thought leaders when it comes to climate and financing and all these issues all gathered in one space. And what you'll see, as in previous COPs, is we will see announcements over the course of the 2 weeks. It's not just that all the announcements will come out at the end. They'll come out every day. There'll be announcements on financing, on adaptation, on, you know, on all the things that we've been talking about. And so I think it's a really good opportunity to kind of equip ourselves with the arguments and the talking points, because we know when we go out there, people will say, well, why should we do this? Because country X is doing that, or country Y is not doing that. So why should we sacrifice? Or why should we like put ourselves behind economically? And so I think it's a really good opportunity to stay across all the different social media channels, the websites and so on that are going to be pumping out the announcements, so that we know what the direction is, where things are going, what countries are moving things in a certain direction. And understanding that COP27 is not an endpoint. No COP is an endpoint. It's a part of a process. And recognizing that and being able to communicate that to other people, because we'll get the usual pushback, which is like, well, everyone's meeting there, they're coming in their private jets and so on like that. They're meeting on the beach for 2 weeks and they're not going to agree anything. That will be the general pushback, you know, from the people that don't want to support this kind of work. So we can equip ourselves to how to respond to those people who are the naysayers, who don't want to be on the right side of history with this. So I think this is a really good opportunity for learning for that. Yeah.
Thanks, Gopal. And yeah, that's a really helpful reminder that this is not the end by a long shot. We know that there's much more that needs to be done, and that as faith communities and as people of faith, personally, it's, you know, it really is part of our sacred duty to engage in this way in the COP, because we don't want to cede the space to the loudest voices in the room, which are not always, many times I'll say they're the most self-interested voices, and maybe not the most values-based voices. And so we absolutely need this witness to be happening at the COP, and to demonstrate that, in fact, faith communities are already acting on climate, and we're modeling behavior change. We're modeling what can be done. We're educating those in our communities. We're advocating, and of course, we're also acting with our money. We are divesting from fossil fuels. We are reinvesting in other solutions, including nature-based solutions. And it's important for us to demonstrate that to the global community. We did have a question in the chat, which I tried to answer, which is there a list of who from the faith communities will be represented at the COP? The challenge with that is there are so many people from so many different faith-based organizations, both here in the US and globally. So many times, various ones of us who are on this call are connected to various other folks, but no one, to my knowledge, has convened a larger list of all the faith-based actors who were there. But that sounds like an amazing project, and I think we should add that to our to-do list for the future, because it would be really impressive to show what the faith presence actually is. And of course, happy to answer any other questions that folks have. And in the meantime, B.
Actually, I just wanted to say, whoever was asking about lists of faith-based groups who are going, I would also suggest, in addition to, we're always trying to kind of corral that universe, and it's always imperfectly done. But as individuals, yes, the Catholic Church is very involved, for the person who asked that in the chat. But for individuals, wherever you are in the United States, the other people you should really take the time to figure out who's going are people in your local area. So often local elected officials or people who are from local colleges and universities. If you are in an area where there's an HBCU, the Historic Black Colleges and Universities will take a cohort of students to the COP every year. So the people in your community who may or may not be going because they represent the faith community, but who in your day-to-day life are the people you're likely to have the opportunity to interact with. It's always a little bit frustrating when we get home and somebody says, "Oh, I didn't even see you there. I was there the whole time too." And you go, "Gosh, it'd be better if we get it kind of coordinated."
Absolutely. Thanks, B. So we do have another question here from Julia, who asks if there are specific delegates from faith-based groups that speak at the COP. So I'm curious whether any of you have heard a faith-based delegate speak at the COP, at any COP.
Not as such. So there are people who you mean on the big stage as the delegate of a country? No, but in the space, there are lots of faith-based voices that are elevated a lot in the process. And they are not only Abrahamic faiths, also. They're indigenous and traditional spokespeople as well.
Yeah, and I want to follow up and say that the platform for which one can watch basically the glorified YouTube of the side events, the other gatherings of an equally big stage will often have faith-based folks organizing discussions and sub-events, and so one can easily just follow along with the column of NGO events for the day and probably see lots of iterations of faith-based communities, local communities, activists from around the world having those conversations.
And I did want to share just a couple of things one of which is that there are country pavilions where many panels take place, and oftentimes those are places where faith-based actors who are in the space are part of panels or speaking to groups. This year, we're very excited that we have a faith-based panel at the America is All In Pavilion. And we will, B is going to be a part of that, as well as Melanie and myself and a couple other folks from the faith community, and we'll be sharing how faith communities are already taking action on climate change. So again, there are some avenues for some faith-based folks to speak. I know Gopal will be on some panels as well at COP27. And so this is a really wonderful way for us to connect with attendees from all different constituencies, you know, business, youth, indigenous voices, so many that we've named, and we hope policymakers as well will be in the room when we're speaking. And so let's see, we have another question from Peter here. Do you anticipate Russia's expanded invasion of Ukraine and the tactic of weaponizing fossil fuel energy supplies being relevant to this COP, to loss and damage or mitigation discussions? And are there ways to hold global bad actors accountable? What a great question, Peter. So I'm gonna throw that one to Melanie to start with, but then hoping that other folks will chime in as well.
I'm thinking about it's really hard for civil society to hold bad actors accountable most of the time, unless there is organized money or organized people. And I think the fact that so many faith-based NGO groups are going to be in attendance and with unified attention is probably one way that we as community civil society can help uphold some ideals that would get to that moral code of like holding bad actors accountable. But I don't know. I'm curious about our Texas spicy person, V or Gopal. Like, how do you anticipate us? Yeah.
I mean, I would answer that question just that it's absolutely relevant to the discussions, and I think that there will be it's relevant because of the substance. So it's relevant because of the nuclear substance, for example. It's also relevant because part of the process here, like, what's a process win is if everybody stays at the table. So if the outcome of the COP is that 90% of the countries continue to work together and 10% of them bail out completely and say we're taking our marbles and going home, that's not just a failure for that 10%, and it's not just a 10% failure for the world, it's a 100% failure, because the climate is not going to do 90% of what it would, you know, it doesn't work that way. So there's sort of a paramount importance to keeping everyone at the table as much as possible. And I think what you'll see is moderation maybe of some of the ways that individual countries might have thought that they would interact with the particularity of Russia for the sake of the small island developing nations, right? That they will not say what they would want to say about Russia because they will not want to ruin the chances of vulnerable people to have a future.
Thanks, Vicky. And Gopal, you get to have the last word here.
Oh, that's very dangerous. What I would say is that the bad actors, whether they're member states or fossil fuel companies or other private sector organizations, they will already know what their positions are before they get to Sharm el-Sheikh. They are developing them and have been developed now. And so what I would say is, like, That's why local advocacy and engagement is so important, because we need to do the work here on the ground before they get on their planes and get to Egypt. Because once they get to Egypt, it's a little bit too late. So that's why the work that IPL does right across the country is so important, because it means we can put the pressure on them and hopefully shift their positions before they get to the negotiating room.
Thank you so much, Gopal. And I know we're getting to the end of time here. Well, the end of our hour, hopefully not the end of time. But we do want to share a few things that we're suggesting as ways for you to get involved. So certainly review the resources available on the IPL website. We've shared that link and we're going to share it again now for you. So you can see many resources, including worship resources that you can use in your religious community, and the Path of Hope resources also listed there. We are also asking folks, as we get close to elections, to pledge to be a faith climate justice voter. So we ask you to take the pledge and vote your values on climate this election season. Elections are really a referendum on the kind of world that we want to see, including a safe and healthy climate for our children and generations coming after us. So please take that pledge and encourage your friends and family to take the pledge as well. We are also text banking voters in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. You can sign up to help text bank those voters and get them out to vote. So you can join a text bank. We're dropping the link in the chat so you will know where and how you can do that. It's a lot of fun, and we do it as groups. So you get to have a good time chatting and being around other people while we're doing that text banking. And also we want to just announce that we will be holding a post-COP webinar. We will be doing a readout of what happened at the COP and what we need to do now based on whatever comes out of the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. That will be on December 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. There will be more information to come, including a registration link, but please mark your calendars to be part of that post-COP webinar as well. And in closing, I just want to thank you for attending today and for being a part of this important conversation. If you have other questions that we have not covered, please send them to the info@interfaithpowerandlight link in the chat. And we will also share the recording and the links from today's webinar via email with you tomorrow. And of course, I want to thank our three amazing panelists today, Bea Moorhead, the Reverend Melanie Mullen, and Gopal Patel. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. This has been a really great conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you in Egypt very soon. And thanks again for our tech help to our team. And thanks to all of you for attending, and blessings on the journey. Thank you so much.